Hello and welcome to Miss Amen's video lecture series. This is the Survey of U.S. American History's lecture series, video 1. In this particular video, we are going to be looking at the age of globalization's effects on the New World, or, in other words, the origins of America. Prior to colonization, and of the colonization by Spain specifically. We'll see a few examples of English and French colonization, but that will be pretty minimal in terms of the course of the scope of this particular lecture. What we're really going to be interested in is how at the end of the Middle Ages gave birth to these more united political governments in Europe, and it encouraged the nations from Europe, from the Atlantic world, to start to seek out outside resources and wealth and power in different locations outside of themselves so they could cement those new political structures. They will have an immense devastation on the native populations who, of course, due to their separate period of development away from Afro-Eurasia, will end up being basically powerless to stop this invasion of their territory and be subjected to a lot of hardships because of it. In this particular PowerPoint, we're going to address very specific questions. First off, would you call the coming of Europe and the resulting death and devastation of the natives conquest, or would you call that genocide? B, what was the main reason for European colonization, and why did it happen when it did, and rather than earlier in history when it could have happened? And C, how was the continents of North, Central, and South America carved up by the European nations? Why was it divided the way it was? So let's begin this course of study by looking at how was North America and South America populated prior to the Spanish invasion. So in order to understand that, we've got to go back to basically World History 1 to see how humans migrated into North and South America early on in history. Human history begins and starts in Africa. We call that the cradle of mankind, and that happens at around 200,000 years ago. Homo sapiens developed there, and around 70 to 50,000 years ago, something strange happens to man. He becomes what we consider an intellectual creature. We're not quite sure why, but there's a significant change, and we think it has to do with language, ironically. So, cradle of mankind, human beings start right there in Africa. That's around the Ethiopia area. That's a general guess by current archaeologists, anthropologists, and geneticists. That's the birthplace. And around 50,000 years ago, and I didn't mark this on the map, by the way, man travels along the coastline of the Middle East, down India, through South Pacific Islands into Australia, and the first group settles in there. Around 45,000 years ago, we have mankind drifting off, leaving the cradle, and going into what we call the nursery of mankind, which is around in Kazakhstan, that kind of generalized location. That's the nursery of mankind. That's the first migrational route. Everybody settles there, and it's from there that the rest of mankind, those who later inhabit the Middle East, India, South Pacific Islands, Europe, Russia, all of them come from the nursery. And that all kind of occurs between the years of 45,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, Europe being the last to be populated. And that's interesting because the reason it's last to be populated is because of a very specific set of geological conditions that were present during these early migrational patterns. And we call that geographic circumstance is known as the Ice Age. The Ice Age basically created a land bridge, and if you notice, that's in blue, between Russia and Alaska, and it also still was heavily situated on, well, in North America. It's on top of the Rocky Mountains, but also all the way, and I didn't mark it there, but it's all the way to Maine, Rhode Island. It's covering those areas. The breadbasket, so the Midwest of North America, it's all covered in glaciers. And it's a blockade. Consider it a blockade. Now, the red dot where Russia is, that's where the Chukchi people live. They are people who have adapted to the climate of the Ice Age. And they're very much dealing with those conditions easily. Well, not easily. It's rough living, but they're living in that area. And the land bridge allowed them a place to cross over into North America. And that land bridge we call Beringia. They're moving back and forth between those two areas, just coming and going based on the climate, based on whatever hunting patterns are going on there, and they're just moving back and forth. At around 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age has fully dispersed. It melts away and the land bridge disappears, which isolates a group of about 10 to 20 people, and that's based on numbers that anthropologists are giving, that ended up getting stranded in North America. They can't move back to their Chukchi relatives over in Russia because there's no land bridge. So that gives them only one option. They have to move down into North America. And it's from those 10 to 20 people where millions of people will be born from in North America and in South America. But when they get to North America, it's basically like a giant paradise. It's been untouched by humankind altogether. The animals have developed completely separate from having to deal with human conditions, so they have no knowledge and no conception of what humans are like. And so basically they've got this rich abundance of food that they could never have possibly imagined prior to this. And it's about 8,000 years ago when this group of people continue to move down, and they get to the tip of South America, and so they're populating all the way down through. Okay, so now as we have seen, North and South America have been populated by people for 10,000 years. Civilizations have been developing for 10,000 years. We're going to move our viewpoint now from North and South America over to Afro-Eurasia, which is Africa, Europe, and Asia, and see what's going on over there. Between 1000 CE to 1500 CE, we have a period that's rising into the age of globalization. Why am I using the term globalization? Well, the reason is because globalization means a worldwide international influence that affects one or more forms of institutions. Institutions being things like politics, economics, resources, migration, etc., etc. So that's why I'm choosing that. It's all these different countries being involved together in those types of issues. We have to understand the development of the American nation as a global issue. It's not only happening to the colonists. It is affecting the entire world, and it's being conducted by the entire world in different ways. Primarily, it's an Atlantic world issue, meaning it's dealing primarily with the countries between and the continents between the Atlantic that touch the Atlantic Ocean. So North America, South America, Europe, Africa. That does not mean Asia is not involved. It's very much involved, but in an indirect way, and we'll get into that in a little bit. The continents that are involved in this process: Europe, Africa, Asia, North America, and South America. So basically the entire world. Hence why it's a global issue. Going back to that first Not the first question. Was it no. The second question, question B, what was the driving reason for European colonization and why did it happen when it did and not earlier? Let's talk about why it didn't happen earlier. We have a problem that's going on in Europe around 500, it starts at 500 CE and it's finishing up by 1500 CE. It's called the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages sometimes labeled. People kind of use the Dark Ages term to talk about really the period between 500 to 1000, in the Middle Ages to refer from 1000 to 1500. So keep that in mind. But they don't really have an interest in the outside world. No, Columbus didn't discover America. Technically, Leif Erikson did on his voyage to Vinland, which was actually Newfoundland in Canada. And he does set up a small settlement there, but it's abandoned very quickly. They really couldn't fight against the natives. The natives and the Vikings were at pretty much equal strength. And so there really wasn't a way to stick around there. And most people in Europe hadn't heard of that voyage. That voyage is pretty much isolated in knowledge between Greenland and Iceland. So even if people had heard about it, though, it wouldn't have mattered, because there's really no real reason for them to be interested in heading out there. They've already got too much land they don't know what to do with. Understand that during the Dark Ages, the Black Death, which happened in 1300 CE, had killed off a third of all of Europe's population. So they don't have enough population to send over someplace else. They still have to rebuild what they've got. Around 500 CE, Rome had fallen and put people into the Dark Ages. So there's no unified government at that time. All the governments during feudalism are very weak, very unreliable. And let's go take a look at that in terms of maps. So if you look at the map above, the top map, that's Europe around 500 AD. And if you look closely enough, you'll notice that they're labeled as kingdoms. The kingdom of the Ostrogoths, the kingdom of the Vandals, the kingdom of the Burgunds, the kingdom of the Franks, the Anglos, the Saxons. Some of these don't even have kingdoms because they're really just a group of tribes. And there's all these tribes that get pretty big, but they're weak. They have to have all these lords taking care of. The lords are like mini kings. So they have all their little fiefdoms, and they're trying to keep the other fiefdom next door from invading. And so because those governments are so weak, their cultures develop as an agrarian, very self-sufficient economies. They don't have a need for outside resources. There's not even incentive to trade with the outside world, because if you try to, you're going to get attacked by bandits. There's no government to protect you on the roads, so you're going to get your stuff stolen. So nobody's really all that encouraged to go out and sell stuff. So of course they're not reaching out to other parts of the world to try to negotiate global trade. What occurs around 1500 AD, and this is what's important in terms of colonization, is things change immensely. The Dark Ages pretty much end. New governments form. We have the Holy Roman Empire. We have the Empire of Hungary, of France, of England. The Ottoman Empire, massive, very powerful Muslim empire. The power of Spain, even Russia's developing into an imperial center. So all these places are now very, very different. They have strong, strong governments. With these strong governments comes several issues. You don't want, France attacking you if you're England. You don't want to deal with those kind of issues, these infighting anymore. Why fight within ourselves? Let's look for resources somewhere else. And there's this long-standing tradition of these cultures fighting against each other. You know, France versus England, France versus Spain, France versus the Holy Roman Empire, England versus the Holy Roman Empire. They're all fighting amongst each other, and they're very costly. It requires a lot of money and a lot of human capital, meaning you have to execute a lot of people, you know, put them forward in the charge to go off and die. So that becomes very expensive. And people get really tired of war when it lasts a long time. You had the 100 Years' War, you had the 50 Years' War. I mean, like, there's all these major battles going on. And they're tired of doing that, and they can't finance them very well. Those infighting is expensive. And so they need to find a way to start making money. Another occurrence that's happening at this time is religion. There's a change in religion. The Protestant Reformation has taken place. That was with Martin Luther, where he basically said the church and the Pope, specifically Catholicism, is wrong in how it does things. We can lead ourselves. And John Calvin, a disciple of, essentially, Martin Luther, goes off and kind of cements it all with another new idea called predestination, which basically states that God's already decided if you're saved or not, if you're going to heaven, before you're born. And you don't know if you're going to heaven or not, but you can take a look at who you are. If you are very kind to other people, very saintly in your behavior, if you work really hard and have a good work ethic, and if you're successful at what you do, obviously you have been predestined to be saved by God. This, of course, produces a lot of anxiety to be able to meet these ideals and to be able to fully practice this new faith. But it also produced a lot of strong incentives to be good and to succeed. And so they're going to be chafing at the religious intolerance that's within their own nations, and they want to be able to practice as they want. There's massive food and land shortages that are occurring in Europe at this time. And they both happen simultaneously because they're part of the same problem. And it comes from this particular word, mercantilism. Massive amounts of land, especially in England, but all over Europe, are being converted for grazing sheep because the wool market is exploding. And as it's exploding and people are making a lot of money off the wool market, they're converting all this land for the sheep, which means they're not using the land for a very important aspect, which is food. So people are going hungry in a time when Europe is finally starting to recover from the Black Death and all these different wars in terms of population. We're finally having an explosion in the birth rate, but there's no way to feed those people because we're too busy making profit. Mercantilism develops out of this food and land problem because the wool market basically, as they're selling all this wool, it gluts the market. It just overflows the market with wool, and the price of wool plummets. And so people stop making money, and they go, oh my gosh, we got a problem. So they're trying to make sense of economics, and what they come up with is this idea of mercantilism, that any person or nation can grow rich only at the expense of another, and that a particular nation's health is dependent upon selling as much as you can to outsiders and buying as little as possible from them. So you need to have enough personal resources to sustain yourself, self-sustainability, but you want to take and use those resources also to push them out to foreign markets. Well, you can't have both in their opinion at this moment. You need to go find outside places to get these resources, these raw materials, and additional markets to sell these goods to. So a process of issuing charters takes place. And what charters are basically government-issued companies. The government says, yes, you can start a corporation, and that's where the term comes from, corporations from these charters, to go out and dominate a particular resource or a particular activity. And so these charters are given out to only certain groups of merchants, and they end up having monopolies over certain issues. So there's a monopoly on the wool market, there's a monopoly on the sugar market, there's a monopoly on the banana market, etc., etc. This age of globalization really, in terms of all these things that they need, forces Europe to look outside of its own borders and say, okay, well, we want access to Asian markets because they're rich. Same with the Middle Eastern markets, because the Arabic tradition, the Islamic tradition, very rich, very powerful, very wealthy. We want access to that. Same with Africa. Africa is a very rich, prosperous continent because of several major powers that are residing there, such as the Songhai, Mali, etc., etc. We want access to those markets. How do we also get new land? There's no new land to take in Europe, so how do we get new land to have access to new resources? So they've started to look, how can we go take over different areas? Now, keep in mind, they also don't understand or don't know at this moment that there is the continents of North and South America. They have no realization of that. But the fact that they need this stuff causes them to look outwards. And it will affect massive changes in terms of Atlantic world politics, so how the nations in Europe interact with each other. It will also change the politics of the New World, that being the New World, quote unquote, being North and South America. They're not really new. They've been there forever, for 10,000 years. But it's new to Europe, so that's why they call it the New World. And it's going to affect all sorts of changes to the New World, both devastating and I guess you can claim some minor benefits. But that's up to you, and you can decide if that's really true. So let's look at Africa's role in terms of colonization and the colonization of the New World. Africa's got some impressive cities and some impressive governments. As I mentioned earlier, Mali and Songhai, as you can see them marked on the map, over in Western Northern Europe. But and there's a number of other empires that are listed here. Some are come and gone, long come and gone. Zulu, classic Egypt, Kush. Ethiopia is still present. It's still going on. Ghana's gone, though, and by 1500, Mali, too, will be gone and taken over by the Songhai. But within Songhai, Mali area, there's a city called Timbuktu. And this is probably the most famous African city. It was known as the City of Gold. It was a place where ivory, silk, gold, salt are all being traded regularly. Incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful. And also understand that Africa has a long-standing tradition of slavery. It is not the type of slavery that we think of when we think of U.S. slavery. The U.S. slave system was very modern and very different in comparison to all ancient versions of slavery. It's unique in its own setup. African slave systems, basically, here's the basic breakdown. They retained their legal rights. They could marry, they could have children, etc. You couldn't just kill them because you felt like it, that kind of thing. It was a specified time limit. Until your debt was paid or until your criminal offense had been paid for in a considered length of time, you were a slave. But it wasn't like you were a slave forever. It wasn't, I became a slave, so now I'm going to be a slave for as long as I live. Not like that. Lastly, if you had children during this time period, your children did not inherit your bondage. They were considered freemen and exempt from that because they didn't do anything wrong. Makes sense, right? So the slave system of Africa has a very different point of view, and even though they sell slaves to the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English, all at different points, they aren't thinking of, in the beginning, slavery in the way that the U.S. ends up thinking about it. The demand for sugar increased Europe's interaction with Africa. Sugar becomes a huge commodity. It's being grown in first the Mediterranean in quantity, but they couldn't keep up with the production. The sugar, to grow sugar, is a very labor-intensive process, requires a lot of workers. And so because they need more workers and they need more area to grow more sugar to keep up with demand, they start looking at the islands around and areas in Africa to grow sugar because the climate is conducive to growing sugar. You can't grow sugar in Europe's climate. It's just not warm enough. And so they also start looking to gain, the Portuguese start to kick this all off, and they start buying slaves from Africa to import to the Mediterranean and then over to their outposts, colonies on those islands outside of Africa to continue production of sugar. And it will later then travel over to the colonies of Brazil and the Caribbean, who end up being later on being the main exporters of sugar. If you want more information on, especially on this topic of Africa, read pages 18 through 19 in The Unfinished Nation. Now, as I said earlier, Asia is not directly involved with the colonization of the New World. They're not going over and colonizing themselves. Same with Africa. Africa did not personally go over and colonize, but they have major empires that are developing. If you notice, they have a lot more landmass in terms of moving out, so they really don't need to go searching out new locations. They already have enough for their populations overall. But there's a lot of major empires that are extremely complex. They have massive wealth. They have a ton of trade goods. You have the Safavid, the Ottomans, the Ming, the Khanate. These are all, and those are just a few of them. They are, in honesty, more complex than those of Europe. They are far more advanced in terms of technology. They're far more advanced in terms of education and learning. Medicine is by far and away far better in these areas. They understand things like sterilization, the medicinal nature of plants, etc., etc. So health-wise, they're much healthier than their European counterparts. They're much cleaner, too. Just keep that in mind. They actually bathe. So there's this massive amount of wealth that's situated out in those areas. And those markets, the Europeans can't wait to get part of those markets. Well, that's weird. But the problem is, to get to those markets, it's much too costly, much too hard. There's too many bandits that will involve themselves. Getting any kind of things like oranges or food goods is next to impossible because it just takes too long by going via land routes. So they want to do this through the open ocean. But crossing into there is not an easy task. They really can't get through via the Mediterranean through the Red Sea out into there. That's not an option. So they have to go around down the bottom of Africa. And prior to 1500, they did not have the navigational nor boats or technology that would allow them to do that. So up until that point, they only could do it by land. At around 1500s, about the 15th century, which is actually the 1400s, they start to develop those capacities. And Europe now goes, oh, we have the chance to do it. I want access to it. And so different European nations are now vying for who can get over to Asia the fastest, who can open up those trade routes and find a way to Asia the quickest. And it really all begins with Spain, and that's why we're going to focus on Spain for pretty much the duration of this particular lecture. Two important things occur in Spain: the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, which are coming from two very powerful different nations. They unite, and they want to cement their political power. And they also want access to new wealth, to generate new wealth, so they can continue to manage their armies, to manage their military and economic power over the European continent. So let's begin looking at now North and then South America, and looking at who's there, which groups of people are living there and have solidified as different tribes and different empires, and then who's coming over and at what time. So let's start with the Eskimos. They're in the northern part of the North American continent. They're pretty much big game hunters. They do hunting and gathering, no permanent settlements. We have the Algonquin, which is not an empire. It's a loose confederation of tribes. Basically, a bunch of tribes decide that they kind of agree with similar principles, and they're all going to sort of unite, but they're still like individual little kingdoms within them. Not even kingdoms. I mean, they really are just tribal families. And they are hunters and gatherers. They move around. They're part of the woodland tribes of North America. Another woodland tribe is the Iroquois Confederacy. Again, another loose confederation of different tribes basically agreeing to work together and not fighting amongst each other. And they are ranging from New York to the Midwest. Then we have the Muskogee, and they're basically southern and eastern seaboard tribes. And again, primarily not really permanent. There are some permanent settlements within the Iroquois and the Muskogee, but they're small agricultural villages, and more often than not still very nomadic. You can consider that when we're talking about North America, the North American tribes, they typically live more hunter-gatherer nomadic lifestyle. So if you use that as your kind of your baseline for to distinguish how they're living, that'll think they're northern, the hunter-gatherers. If they're southern, and when I say southern, I'm talking everywhere from California, Arizona, New Mexico, down through South America, they tend to be more permanent settlements, agriculturally based, and if you go mid-Mexico down, they're actually large empires. In the northern Mexico, Arizona, California, and New Mexico, all those areas, they're not an empire. They're a confederation of Indians, tribes known as the Pueblos, based on the styling of buildings they built. The first Spaniard, well, he's actually Portuguese, by the way. He's not Spanish. He was financed by the Spanish. Occurs in 1492, and that was Christopher Columbus. We all have heard of Christopher Columbus. In 1492, he sailed the ocean blue, and he discovers what he thinks is India. Of course, it's not, but in his mistake, he calls the natives there Indians. Hence the name, and it's stuck, and we've never gotten rid of it, and it's a complete misconception. Now, contrary to the popular myth that Mr. Columbus was so smart and all the Europeans so dumb that he knew the world was round and everybody else thought it was flat, absolutely not. People were very well aware by this time that the world was definitely round, and in fact, they actually knew the size of the earth. They knew the entire circumference. They were well aware of the size of the earth. And in the Portuguese, being master navigators, was already doing some navigation, thought the Atlantic route was really a waste of time, and it was just a big expanse of ocean, and you could get there quicker by going around the Horn of Africa and sailing over to Asia. Had dismissed Columbus's first claims. That he came to them and said, hey, I've got this great idea. Since the earth is only this big, because he thought the earth was actually much smaller than it actually is, we can just sail, let's just keep sailing west and we'll end up hitting India. And they said, no, that's stupid because the earth is this big. And he's like, no, it's not. So he ends up turning to Spain. Now remember, as I told you before, Spain has acquired new wealth a lot of new power, and they want more wealth to cement that political alliance and to cement their power. So when he comes to them, even though they knew the earth was much larger, and Isabella was quite aware of it, she said, you know what, we got nothing to lose. Here's our chance. Go ahead, sir. I'm going to give you 3 ships, and you go sail over there and get us some wealth. So on his first travel over, he lands in the Caribbean islands, mainly in Hispaniola. Oh, sorry, let me pull that one back. Ah. Well, anyways, so he hits the Caribbean islands, and he brings back some natives that he captures. This is a nice way of saying basically enslaves. And he brings them to Isabella and Ferdinand, and they say, did you meet the Khan of China? And he says, no, I didn't, but here, I've got this, and it's, you know, great wealthy area. I'll go back and get some stuff. So he goes back. Second time, it's a complete disaster. When he finally arrives on his 3rd visit, it is at that point he realizes that he is not in India, but that he has in fact discovered a new land. This basically discredits him. He ends up dying in obscurity. Nobody cares about him till much later in history. And he's poor and broke, and end of him. But his discovery does ignite some excitement in Spain to continue exploring. And so they end up claiming all this new land that was found for themselves, all except, of course, Brazil, because that was given to the Portuguese by the Pope, because the Pope didn't want to offend the Portuguese. Well, and that's that. Oh, and by the way, the people who in Hispaniola that Columbus discovers are known as the Tainto, T-A-I-N-T-O, the Tainto. Keep that in mind. They'll come back up a little bit later in this lecture. Now, just so you have an idea of when other things are occurring, when finally France and England get involved, let's take a look at the English settlement, English and Dutch settlement in the Chesapeake Bay area. Doesn't occur till 1607. And the French colonization in northern North America in the Quebec area doesn't occur till 1608. So you can see there's a large, about 100 years span of time before the French and the English actually start to get involved in colonization. So we've examined the North American tribes and the North American early settlements. Let's look at South America and how that goes. There are several major complex civilizations that are either present when the Spanish show up or had been present and died out before the Spanish show up. First one that we're going to talk about is the Mayans. Most of you have probably heard of the Mayan calendar and all that doomsday stuff. I like this little cartoon because it definitely shows the reality of why the Mayan calendar ends, which is mainly because the culture dies out, and so they quit doing the calendar. It just ends. So, but let's look at it from on the map perspective. The Mayans reside here in the green area, and that was as big as their culture gets. They are gone by 900 CE, but they were a very complex civilization in their heyday. They had a very complex written language, advanced agriculture, advanced calendars. They had mathematics that was as complicated as the Arabic system of math, which is the system of mathematics that we still use today. In fact, our numbers come from the Arabic mathematic tradition. And they were well aware of the math and the concepts that arrived from there. And that's at least 600 years before the Arabic tradition is even developed in terms of mathematics. So they're very, very advanced. More than likely, they disappeared due to food shortages and resource depletion. When I say resource depletion, I'm talking about they lost their water supplies, their soil becomes both eroded, and it doesn't have the nutrients necessary to grow foods. So, and when all of that, of course, occurs, then a lot of political strife and the whole civilization collapsed. And they went off and created several new, or those people probably went off and created several new major complex civilizations. The first one, and the reason it's the first one, because it will die out before the other one, is the Aztecs. They are located in the red. Their capital city, Tenochtitlan, is located where present-day Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, is located. They, well, their ruler at the time was Montezuma II. And they disappear around 1518 CE, which is also the date, or around the date, when the Spanish conquistador, Hernando Cortez, shows up. And it's actually because of the Spanish that the Aztec civilization collapses and disappears. It's taken over by the Spanish, and that's in concert with Hernando Cortez's policies at the time. Then we have the Incas, which are in South America, and that's the span of their empire. It's rather huge. It's where present-day Peru and Chile is located. And they disappear around 1538. I guess we can see what's coming up. Their ruler at the time was Atahualpa. He gained the empire during the 1530s by defeating his brother, killing his brother, and taking over control of the Incan Empire. And their empire comes to a close when Francisco Pizarro shows up. He is also a Spanish conquistador, and he happens to bring about the end of the Incan Empire. Lastly, we want to talk about the Pueblo Indians. The Pueblo Indians are a confederation of different tribes. They're not one empire, but they all reside in northern New Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and Texas. They they disappear around 1598. Not exactly disappear, but their confederation comes to an end because of a Spanish conquistador known as Don Juan de Onate. They were not as easily taken down, though. Well, I don't want to say it like that. It was not like the Aztecs and the Incas went down easily. But because of their loose nature, it was much more difficult to remove their culture from them because they didn't have a stratified government. And in 1906, Santa Fe is established when Don Juan claims that area for Spain, and he starts a practice known as encomenditas, ENCOMIENDAS, which means the right to extract labor and tribute or stuff from the natives on their land. And so he's allowed to give out land to his buddies whenever he feels like it and take that land from the Pueblos. The Pueblos, Indians, were not allowed to own any land. They also were forced into conversion into Christianity, and when they didn't practice Christianity exactly in the way the Spanish wanted them to, they kept implementing their own tribal customs and traditions into their practice of Christianity. They would be killed, brutalized, things like cutting off hands and limbs, and a very nasty situation. So this caused a lot of discontent amongst the Pueblo Indians, and a revolt was led by a man named Pope, who was a Pueblo Indian, and it took Spain about 12 years to kind of reclaim the area and bring it back into their empire. But they did some major changes. They allowed intermarriage. They practiced strong practices of assimilation, so making the Indians behave as Spanish, in other words. That's what assimilation means. They did bring an end to the practice of encomeditas. They also allowed the Pueblos to start owning their own land, and they kind of looked the other direction as the natives practiced their tribal traditions. Some things to keep in mind about North and South America: there is no culture out of any of those that were mentioned that had invented the wheel. There was no need to. The fact is, because North and South America contained no large game that was possible of domesticating. Yes, there was the buffalo, but the buffalo cannot be domesticated for whatever reason. It's not within its nature, I guess, to do so, or they never did so. But that would have been the only large game available. That was located in the plains of the North America, and as you know, none of them very few groups were agriculturally based groups. So in South America and Central America, the biggest game they had was llamas, biggest domesticated animal, and you can't pull a cart with it, so there was no reason for the wheel. And because things like the wheel wasn't developed, they also didn't develop things like steel, and metalworking was not a common trait of any of these groups. Most advanced metal they worked with was pretty much silver, gold, and copper, and maybe some bronze. So right now, based on what we've learned, we have to stop and ask an important question. Why were the conquistadors and the colonists so successful at subjugating these immensely large and powerful empires in such a short amount of time as well? They were able to do this so quickly and so efficiently, and this kind of begs that question, well, why could they do that? If these... And you have to understand, the populations of these previous cultures are numbering in the millions. So they have huge populations, they know the land, they are well acquainted with it. What makes the conquistadors and colonists so successful? Well, okay, so in order to understand the Spanish and the colonists' success in taking down these massive empires and these massive tribes, hinged on three major issues: germs, technology, and their ideas about the world. There's a great book written by a brilliant anthropologist of our day and age, still alive, still very much working. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's been influential in changing a lot of conceptions about why Europe had the success it did. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that come from that book. First off, the biggest reason, the largest reason for their success. If this hadn't been involved, there would have been no chance, absolutely no chance that the Europeans could have dominated. And it hinged on germs. When I say germs, I'm meaning diseases. Understand that North and South America are developing for 10,000 years, completely isolated away from Afro-Eurasia. And Afro-Eurasia had been developing large urban populations throughout the continent and had developed a series of different diseases that the North and South Americans had never encountered before. Influenza, smallpox, measles, and typhus, to name a few of the major ones. And the biggest one, the one we're most that we're going to spend more time and you'll see come up more often, is smallpox. Just absolutely... It made the Black Death, so yeah, put it this way. It made the Black Death look like a cakewalk. And the Black Death killed off 1/3 of Europe's populations. Smallpox did more damage than the Black Death by unbelievable numbers. And just so you get a nice idea of kind of how major this was, let's look at a few numbers. Hispaniola, where Columbus had landed, went from a population of 1 million people down to 500 in 12 years. The Tainto to this day are now extinct because of their interaction with the Europeans. The Incas, 95% of their population dead within a few years' contact of the Europeans. So European diseases played the largest role. in taking out the natives. And it's because that these epidemics came about, the Spanish really didn't have to fight large numbers of people. Their first attempts are usually very pathetic. When you look at the first attempt of Cortez, for example, or Pizarro, it's sad. They're going, with 600 men against 80,000. It's just a pathetic attempt, and they're humiliated. But within a few years, diseases had worn down the populations, for the most part, to make it really easily to conquer them. So they just didn't have the people power to defend against the Spanish. Some of the ideas that the Spanish are carrying with them, they look at the natives and they don't see metalworking, and they don't see carted vehicles, so they look at them as savages, and they implement a policy of do as you please. If you can just slaughter whoever you want, you can enslave them, it doesn't matter, they're not really humans, they're not really people, we don't need to treat them nicely. So that's part of the ideals. Because the population is dying, and because of not just guns, but the technology of the time that the Spanish are bringing over, technology in so far as we are talking about military technology. Military technology allowed certain victory. They have guns. Now, understand they're using musket-loaded guns. There's no rifling involved with that, which means they're very inaccurate. They're pretty pathetic, in fact, in terms of how much damage you can do and how quickly you can do that damage. They actually had to resort more to their steel, which is their swords, and their plated armor that protected them. Remember, the natives are wearing pretty much leather, so they don't really have good protection against swords, whereas these conquistadors are using swords at this point, and then later more guns come into play, because over the course of the next 100, 200 years, there's a lot of technology developing guns to be more sophisticated weapons. They also have cannons, and the fact that these are loud, obnoxious sounding things, the natives get very scared because they don't know what's going on. They've never heard it before. They also have horses, the Spanish. Since the Spanish have horses, they're able to move very quickly and pull a lot of equipment very quickly. So that allowed them certain victory. Because they are achieving victory so quickly, it shows them evidence of what they call divine providence. That means that God is obviously honoring them and showing that they are the superior, and therefore they have the right to take over this land and do as they please. So that do as you please policy gets reinforced and continues to perpetuate itself in this cycle of they're dying, so obviously we're superior attitude. So with all this being said, we've heard a lot of horrific stories in terms of how the natives are dealing with and being subjected to European conquest. Was there any benefits for the natives? That's an arguable question, and it depends on how you want to see it. There are very few, nonetheless. First off, they get some new crops, bananas and sugar. Both of these crops require large plantations to be harvested. They're very labor-intensive crops. Well, sugar more so than bananas. Bananas are just trees. But they're based on a plantation conception of harvesting it. So that only led to more enslavement. So I'm not really sure if you could call that a real benefit. But that's how some people view it, and I'll put it out there. They did gain some new livestock, and for those who were agricultural based, this was pretty helpful. They gained the access of cattle, pigs, and sheep. And the most important contribution, and this one arguably is definitely the best benefit that came about from contact with the Europeans, was horses. There's no such thing as wild horses. The wild Mustangs are not really wild. Dismiss that idea right now. They are domesticated animals. They're more like feral cats. Think of them like that. But the natives did make good use of the horses, and it was a nice symbiotic relationship to gain that. And it transformed their societies vastly. The benefits for Europe. They gained new agricultural techniques. They could not use their agricultural techniques from Europe. They were failing miserably. And it was the natives that trained them in how to work the land in North and South America. And if it hadn't been for the natives training them, there would have been no success for the colonists. The colonists would have absolutely perished. So, thanks to the natives, the colonists did survive. They gave the colonists some new crops that are so staple today that it'd be hard to imagine them out of our diet. I don't think I could live without potatoes, tomatoes, and sweet potatoes, and peppers, or corn. Maybe beans and squash, arguably, but the rest, and pumpkins, well, pumpkin pie, oh my gosh, I don't know. Nope, don't think I could live without it. So these are become staples in European diets. It's, you know, you think of the Italians and pasta and tomato sauce. Well, that didn't really occur till after the 1500s. And it comes about because of this relationship with North America. Potatoes and the Irish, I mean, they seem like they're one and the same, but they're not. They only occur after the 1500s. So this is a huge benefit to Europe. Europe gains, the Europeans, colonists gain access to wives, usually through forced marriage, but understand that when they're first coming over, the population of European men to women, the ratio is 10 to 1, so there isn't really a way to reproduce children, and so they need wives, and so they start taking wives from the native populations. And then two new social hierarchies emerge. Not exactly new, but become integral components to the system that will definitely change how people interact with each other for years to come. First off, we have the indentured system, which is basically you contract with a master to work for that person for a number of years, and then either that pays off your debt or you will get paid upon completion of work. And then there's the slave system, because, you know, paying people to work is obviously too much capital to waste, so why not keep those people forever and work them to death? What a better solution. So, with that being said, this concludes your first lecture on the origins of American history.